What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're gonna be taking a look at this video from SJ Thomason.
Hello, you've reached SJ Thomason with Christian-apologist.com. Today I'm going to present to you 8 facts about Christianity. Well, we could also call the facts well-supported claims, but they're in support of Jesus' resurrection. And if Jesus' resurrection is true, Jesus is Lord.
As you know, I've recently had a conversation with SJ here about this very topic. And just to be upfront with you guys, today's video is going to be sponsored by the Chrestus app. So if you want to hit up its link down in the description, it's both on iPhone and Android. If you want to go down there, get the app, all of the information I'm going to present today is in that app. If you want to know more about the Mythicist position and the arguments against Mythicism and Mythicism's answers for those arguments, then please get the Chrestus app. If you want to know why SJ is wrong in this video, then please stay tuned.
I have presented the 8 well-supported claims with the agreed-upon modifications right now in this video. I assert that the best explanation for the 8 claims is that Jesus is risen and he is divine.
Just by the definition of supernatural, the premise can never be actually proven. Natural explanations will always supersede supernatural ones, which is kind of ironic if you think about it. Jesus Christ rising from the dead and being completely divine will never be more probable than any other natural explanation.
If you take all 8 of the claims and you put them together and you look for one single explanation that explains everything, the only explanation is Jesus is risen. There is no other alternative.
This is a false dichotomy. Any historian would tell you this is a completely shit way of looking at history. History is based on probabilities and is also subject to the bias of the person that is interpreting the information. But we can be as non-biased as we can and just focus on the facts. The fact is, SJ reveals her unfalsifiable narrative. She claims there is literally nothing that would convince her that Jesus rising from the dead and being completely divine is less probable than a natural explanation, which is totally bass-ackwards to the whole natural-supernatural dichotomy. A good historian would admit that there are alternative explanations for things, but there are varying probabilities at which they could be true. SJ can never find the truth using an unfalsifiable narrative. She then goes on to levy this unfounded and downright insulting charge against mythicists.
But before I present these 8 claims, let me first dispel the notions of the Jesus mythicists who may be reading this or hearing about this and wondering whether or not Jesus is true. Several quotes from a well-known agnostic who has studied the historical person of Jesus serve this purpose. New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman in 2012 stated, "Jesus existed, and those vocal persons who deny it do so not because they have considered the evidence with the dispassionate eye of historian, but because they have some other agenda this denial serves." He also said the idea of Jesus' resurrection did not derive from pagan notions of a God simply being reanimated. It is derived from Jewish notions of resurrection as an eschatological event in which God would reassert his control over this world. There is no unambiguous evidence that any pagans prior to Christianity believed in dying and rising gods, let alone that it was a widespread view held by lots of pagans in lots of times and places. You see, Bart Ehrman, though being an agnostic, is at least honest about Jesus' historicity.
First of all, I'm not the one here with an agenda to push, okay? You are, SJ. I mean, I'm not sure if you're just not self-aware or something, but you just described your own position, not mine. You're attempting to gaslight the mythicist community, and that just makes you look bad. Now, I can't speak for every single mythicist out there, but I do know that I have thoroughly reviewed all the information about this particular topic, and I have come away thinking that Jesus probably didn't exist. Also, what agenda would I have to push exactly? Knowing the truth of reality? I would hope everybody would have that agenda. And finally, there were other religions that had resurrection that was integral to their own theology. The Jews were just following a trend because that's how shit works. Another component of Christianity that was also a trend was baptism. So don't try to tell me that Christians weren't following some kind of trend.
The first claim that I would like to present to you, and actually hold on one second as I bring this up so you can view it. The first claim is Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We have extra biblical support for this.
No, you don't. You have extra biblical evidence that Romans crucified people. There's biblical support for the Jews crucifying people as well. What you don't have is solid proof that the Romans specifically crucified the originator of Christianity named Jesus. That is the evidence that you do not have. What most likely happened is that multiple sects of Jews looked to the scriptures and had revelations or hallucinations in order to know what this Jesus or this Messiah supposedly did here on earth. Because, as Ignatius of Antioch points out, now the virginity of Mary was hidden from the prince of this world, as was also her offspring, and the death of the Lord. 3 mysteries of renown, which were wrought in silence, but have been revealed to us. Now, Ignatius was writing in the 2nd century, so of course this is not going to give us a clear indication of what actually happened around the time that Jesus died, but it does give us insight into the types of theologies that were going around at this time in history. Ignatius is solid proof that there was at least some kind of gospel or theology or group out there that felt like Jesus, or the Messiah rather, came down, fulfilled all of these things, was killed, and then resurrected, all in silence, and was only revealed to them at the very end through like a star in the sky. Philo of Alexandria is an example of a Jew that was using the scriptures to build this skeleton model of what the Messiah was and what his characteristics were. And these scriptures would have been the Jewish theology. Now, if you fast forward a little bit to Paul only gets his information from scripture and from revelation. So he had hallucinations and he read a book. That's pretty much the evidence that Paul has. So no actual person on earth has given us any kind of information about a real historical Jesus. It's always just been either books that were talking about the Messiah to come, or it was books that was talking about prophecies about the Messiah, and then hallucinations from delusional people. See, the 1st century Jewish Christians and Jews themselves considered scripture to be more reliable than human testimony. This is even blatantly in the Bible. The first 2 Gospels in the New Testament are prime examples for how they use the scriptures to build a narrative around this Messiah character. And now at this point, she's going to go through the evidence contained within Josephus.
Josephus, who lived between 37 and 100, wrote Antiquities. He said, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Josephus was not a Christian.
And some other bunk evidence for a historical Jesus. Basically, she just rattles off the secularized version of the Testimonium Flavianum, which removes any kind of Messiah type of reference or any kind of reference that would actually indicate like a Christian writer. Because at the bare minimum, people agree that it was heavily interpolated. But I argue that it was completely inserted by a later author, and I have a lot of evidence to support that claim. For one thing, the passage that she recites here is a much later redacted version of the Testimonium Flavianum. And it's important to know that this particular redaction is unsupported in the extant versions that we have. And she comes to this redacted version of the Testimonium Flavianum through Syriac and Arabian sources. Alice Wheely, a Christian historian, shows how these versions of the Testimonium Flavianum can only be traced back to Eusebius's version. So these are not independent copies that are distinct from the Eusebian version. They stem directly through chain of custody directly from Eusebius. So these particular redactions cannot be any more accurate to the original version of it than the current extant version of the Testimonium Flavianum. But this extant version of the Testimonium Flavianum is problematic in and of itself. Like I said before, we do know at the very least a Christian heavily doctored this passage, but most likely it's been completely inserted. This is supported by the fact that the logical flow of the passages around the Testimonium does not actually make sense with the Testimonium in there. The Testimonium breaks the flow of logic from the preceding paragraph to the paragraph coming after. This type of patchwork is indicative of a forgery. Scholars have also done textual analysis on the Testimonium Flavianum and found that the wording and how he uses words in it do not match any of the other texts or how Josephus writes in general. They found that verbs are used differently, time is organized differently, the absence of a plot is kind of strange. This passage only makes sense to Christians, and his alignment with the Christians seems really out of place for a Roman Jew. So as you can tell, there's a lot of problems with this passage, either an interpolated version or in its current state.
Another person who is not a Christian is Bar Serapion. In 73 AD, he wrote, "For what advantage did the Jews gain by the death of their wise king?"
Bar Serapion, of course. If you want a complete refutation of Bar Serapion as being evidence for Jesus, I got a card that'll probably pop up somewhere around here, or a link in the description that will give you a better understanding of it. It's actually a video that I did. So if you want to learn more about that, then please go to that. But what I will say here to refute her bullshit is that the fact that he calls this Messiah character, or the character of the Jews, to be a wise king shows that, he's getting his information from Christians instead of independent accounts. And also, he was most likely writing in the 2nd century, although scholars do date this as early as 73 AD. But even by 73 AD, you had Paul and you have Mark that were in circulation. So no, Bar Serapion is not an independent source. He definitely got his information from Christians.
Tacitus, in 110, in his Annals 1544, said, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Chrestus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius."
Hold up. I'm going to let you finish. Actually, I'm not going to let you finish. That would be lying. I'm going to stop you right here. So Tacitus is a highly used but also contested source to use. For one thing, nobody till the 4th century CE knew that Tacitus actually blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome. There have been other historical documents that talk about the martyring and persecution of Christians after the burning of Rome, and none of them actually mention any of this shit. So there were most definitely people that would have cited this kind of information. Most likely this is a Christian interpolation of the passage, because Tacitus seems to be indicating here Chrestus or Christian. And a lot of people want to say that that's just some kind of slang term or inflammatory term for Christians, but there's no actual evidence that that is the case. One important thing to note here about the Chrestus name is that it is actually a name, whereas Christ is a title. But let's just say we give you that this is a reference to a Christ or a Christos. This only puts the Christians in Rome in 64 AD. This does not actually say, hey, a guy named Christ, Jesus Christ, existed and started the religion of Christianity. So, I mean, this doesn't actually prove what you're wanting it to prove. By 64 AD, you already had Paul's writing that was going around, as well as the other oral kind of gospels that were going around. So, I mean, this was definitely because of some kind of Christian information or a Christian interpolate.
Suetonius in 120 said, "Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome." This occurred in 49, according to Acts 18:2, "who, instigated by Chrestus, never ceased to cause unrest."
Ah, yes, Suetonius. I'm so glad you brought him up. Actually, Suetonius says that Chrestus was the instigator. Some later interpolators have changed it to be Christos or whatever, but originally it was Chrestus. But this particular reference doesn't coincide with the minimal historicity argument. For one thing, in minimal historicity, you would expect Jesus to have been killed around like 30, 33, somewhere in that time frame. But this particular instance here with Suetonius happens in 49 AD. So that would place the time frame for like Paul writing his shit and everything like that, and that whole Pauline Creed or whatever, or the Apostles' Creed or whatever, whichever creed it was that was supposedly written like 3 years after he supposedly died, or 5 years, whatever. I mean, it would throw off the timing of all of that other evidence. So I don't think that you really want to use Suetonius here in order to support your argument. We also know that Suetonius definitely didn't like just accidentally misspell the name Chrestus instead of writing Christos, because later on in Nero, in one of his books called Nero, he talks about the Christians and Christiani. So he knows he knows that group, he knows how to spell their name. He wouldn't have accidentally misspelled it here.
In the Talmud, it states, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Jesus the Nazarene. And
all right, I'm going to have to stop you again, because the Talmud is just way too late of a document for you to actually use to support your argument. So find better evidence. We want evidence that's as close to when Jesus supposedly lived as possible, because the later you get, the more and more likely it becomes that Christians and their theology influence later historical documents, like the Talmud.
Isaiah 53:5 says, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This was written around 700 years before Jesus even walked the earth. Psalm 22:16-18, written...
Oh God, she's in her whole prophecies proof shit kind of death spiral. Oh God. We're only on the first bullet point, and holy shit, how long is this going to take? Like I've said before in this video, supernatural explanations are never going to be more probable than natural explanations. So whether you want to say that these prophecies were like a post hoc assertion about Jesus, or that these prophecies are way too vague to, cement Jesus in history, either way that you go, the prophecies argument can never cement Jesus in history. If you consider the fact that the Jews were looking to the scriptures to describe this Messiah figure that was supposed to come and save them, then it totally makes sense that the Gospels, each in their own different ways, would fulfill every single prophecy that was in the Old Testament. This is representative of the multiple sects of Jewish Christians that were running around in the first century. All of them had their own different ideas about what the Messiah was supposed to do here on earth. It's also why you have an untold number of different Gospels and letters and all these other books that were left out of the Bible, because they all had their own ideas about what happened to this Messiah. And you know why? Because he didn't exist, and all they had were prophecies in old books that they had to glean information from. And then you also had the crazy fucks that were having hallucinations. That's all that you had to tell you about this Jesus figure.
My second item is women first discovered his empty tomb, and we have no evidence to suggest anyone claimed Jesus was buried anyplace else or was merely a myth until about 1700 years later. His dead body was never produced.
She's completely wrong about both of these points. First, there were definitely people that were saying that Christians just had a supernatural or mythical kind of faith. But there were also Docetists around at that time that believed in a purely celestial Jesus. Believing that Jesus never actually came here on earth, but yet he did everything in a heavenly kind of realm. And this matches the Ascension of Isaiah, because in the Ascension of Isaiah, it's a first century Jewish document that actually has the prophet Isaiah, who is very integral to the whole prophecy kind of argument. He goes up to this celestial realm and sees all of this happen to Jesus in a celestial realm. So there's a lot of corroborating evidence to suggest that there were plenty of Christians in the first century that considered Jesus, or this Messiah figure, to be a purely celestial person. This is just an attempt of SJ and people like SJ to play the no true Christian argument, that these people did not actually believe in these things, or any other kind of way you want to argue your way around it. But I get that you want to bend reality to your whim, but you just can't do that.
All 4 Gospels attest that women discovered the empty tomb. Now, let's recall that women were treated as second-class citizens back then, and their testimonies were not considered valid, as per historians such as Josephus.
This is her attempting to use the criterion of embarrassment. And I have to say, it's rather embarrassing. She simply cannot know what was embarrassing to these first century Christians. I mean, she thinks it would be embarrassing for them if women found the tomb empty because nobody would trust women. But an important thing to note here, which is something I got from Pelagia, thank you Pelagia, the whole not trusting women thing was primarily in like courts of law and everything that. It wasn't about like trusting women like in the public space of this public sphere or whatnot. And that's what the stories about Jesus were. Another thing to consider is that the women that found the empty tomb were not nobody. I mean, they weren't just random fucking women that came across the tomb. They were people that were integral to the story of Jesus. This particular argument is also self-refuting because we have a lot of evidence that shows how the Bible has been changed over the years, even in the 2nd century. If you look to Mark and his long ending, the long ending was added to corroborate the other Gospels, and it was added in the 2nd century by people that were embarrassed by the fact that Mark doesn't account for the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. So, I mean, you say that this was an embarrassing thing, but then we have actual embarrassing things, that we have actual evidence to show that it was changed and inserted later to make it less embarrassing. So, you need to be able to account for that. Like, why was that added or changed? Was that embarrassing? If they had the chance to change that, then why wouldn't they have changed that? This actually has a legal principle that we use now attached to it called statement against interest. But even then, the juries are warned not to take this as concrete evidence or anything like that. But in order for even that consideration, you have to have corroborating information to support this statement against interest. The whole statement against interest criterion of embarrassment is a very weak argument to use, and it doesn't actually show that women found an empty tomb. She then goes on to describe this whole conspiracy about the apostles like stealing the body of Jesus and everything like that, or paying people off or something. I don't know. At that point, it's just a red herring argument trying to distract you from the fact that she's using weak evidence. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. Next time, we will be continuing on this rabbit hole, which she's got a whole list of other points to get to, but she had a lot contained in this first bullet point. It's like one bullet point with like fucking 5 different sub-bullet points. But if you want to know more about the mythicism position and its arguments against the historicity of Jesus, please see my playlist here called Did Jesus Exist? It's got a lot of great videos in it. Binge watch that shit to help me out. But let me know what you thought about this episode. Leave your comments down below, and while you're down there, make sure you smash that like button. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.